Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Pattison, and I'm the branch librarian of the Jamaica Plain Branch Library. I'd like to welcome you all to the program today, which is co-sponsored by the library, the Jamaica Plain Historical Society, the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, and the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. I'd now like to introduce Dana Hourigan. Dana works at the Public Library in Easton, where the filmmakers' offices are located. Several years ago, he showed her the trailer of his latest project, and she was hooked. So hooked that when he asked if she'd like to help market it, she jumped on board. After seeing the film today, she's pretty sure that you will feel the same way. Today, she spends a lot of time hiking through Borderland State Park and appreciating the legacy that Blanche left for women's rights. Thank you, Dana.
Thanks for joining us. We are full of gratitude that Blanche's story came to life on the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. After the film today, you're going to get to join the Q&A with Barbara Berenson, who is an expert. She's the expert on the topics that you'll see in this film. And be sure to look for her in the film. Barbara is the author of the definitive book on suffrage, Massachusetts in the Woman Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers. She received a JD from Harvard Law, an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government, and a BA from Harvard College. Barbara is on the advisory board of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, which is one of our co-sponsors today. The filmmaker Kevin Friend is shooting on location today, so he can't join us, and my apologies for that. But we do have executive producer Bill Ames here today. And if you have questions and want to continue the conversation after the film with Kevin, please just go to our Facebook page, Borderland the Documentary, and ask your questions there after the film. And now we're going to get the film started, and we'll see you all back here in 55 minutes. Enjoy.
Hey, do please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. We have one question about the papers, but given the final piece about the obituary, I wanted to pose this question to Barbara Berenson. It's a big one. What does it take for a woman to earn a place in history? Why are some names remembered and others forgotten?
That is an excellent question. It's a great place to start. I think that history has, in general, paid little attention to women. I'm sure many of you are aware that, for instance, the New York Times has been running a section on forgotten obituaries over the last year or longer, when they have elevated the history of minorities and women that sadly have either been forgotten and ignored, or like in the case of Blanche Ames, her obituary focused on the work she did in cooperation with her husband. I think on a bigger picture level, in response to your question, Laura, that one of the issues is that in history where women and minorities, so people that have historically been marginalized, I think there's been very little room in the public consciousness for more than a couple of names of women related to any particular undertaking. So for instance, African-American woman during the abolitionist era, people may know Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman when there were dozens they could choose from. The women's suffrage story has become encapsulated by the work of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, when there are tens, hundreds, thousands of women to draw from. The second wave of feminism, people think about Shirley Chisholm, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. And I think so long as women take a back seat in history and history classes, often in the books that people read, then only a small number of names are remembered. And the best way to ensure a wider variety of names is remembered is to pay far greater attention to the history so that one can think about it in a far broader contextual manner. I think you were on mute.
Thank you. We have a question about Blanche Ames' papers and whether they are at Smith College or whether they are at Stonehill College.
Well, I know where the Blanche Ames papers are. I don't know where all the family members are. Blanche's papers herself those papers are at Smith College. And that is the place to go to see them all. However, the papers of many of the organizations she was involved with, such as the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, the Birth Control League of Massachusetts, and other organizations, some are at Smith, but many of those papers are also at Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. So I would say to do a thorough search of Blanche's work, the first two places that one should go would be Smith College and Schlesinger Library. I don't know about the holdings of Stonehill College.
Thank you. Another big question. How can we connect Blanche Ames' story to the story of women today?
Well, I think that some of that was through manners that were done very effectively at the end of the film. Certainly, obviously, the past is important because it gives insight into how changes developed. I mean, I think that the whole women's suffrage campaign, the whole birth control campaign, are lessons not only in understanding our history, but also in how social movements are built, developed, how coalitions are formed, how change is made, and how change can be made even in the face of a conservative era and backlash. I think those are incredibly important lessons for today. Certainly, some of the issues that Blanche cared most deeply about, the right of each person in a democratic society to cast a vote, the right of women to control their own bodies. I mean, I sometimes think that Blanche Ames would be shocked if she realized that today, almost 100 years later, those debates are as live as they were in her own lifetime. But maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she would understand that history ebbs and flows and that backlash is always something that people who want to make change have to confront.
I have a question saying, and I don't understand why Blanche's contemporaries were opposed to the vote. Can you explain further?
Yes. So throughout the women's suffrage movement, I mean, one of the things that makes the women's suffrage movement so interesting, and of course that movement lasted for nearly a century, beginning in the 1830s, and the 19th Amendment was not added to the Constitution until 1920. And just to digress for a moment, I should just point out, of course, that 1920 is not the end of the story, because even after 1920, certain women in this country were not able to vote. Asian immigrants who were not naturalized couldn't vote. Native American women, by and large, couldn't vote. And many African American women were stripped of their right to vote in the South until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. But even focusing on the period 1830 to 1920, the conventional suffrage story, there were always many women opposed to the expansion of that right. Why it was is a complicated story, but I think the short answer is that many people fear change, and that these many women had been led to believe and had believed that they belonged in the domestic sphere, that it was inappropriate for them to engage in the world of commerce, the world of politics, that they weren't well enough informed, they weren't smart enough, and that they belonged at home. And so many women were simply not interested in suffrage. The ones who actively opposed it and who led the opposition, of course, to be able to do that requires leisure and often requires money. And many of those women who were leaders of the anti-suffrage movement, like Blanche's relative, who was mentioned in the documentary, are women of privilege, women who believed that, rightly or wrongly, they believed that their status in society was protected and privileged because of the status of the men in their life, their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, and so forth, and they feared change. Many of them were also nativists, and they feared the power, they feared expanding the vote to include immigrant women, to include African-American women, and so forth. So they were also trying to protect a certain vision of society that they felt benefited them more without their having the vote than with the great expansion of the vote. So there were a variety of different reasons. And one of the things that makes the women's rights movement, and this is true, those of you watching who of course remember in person, for instance, the 1970s, 1980s, the era of Phyllis Schlafly, the era of today even, you know well that there are often many women who oppose extending rights to other women.
You mentioned privilege and leisure, and I wanted to ask if you could speak to how Blanche Ames used her privilege to help other women.
So Blanche Ames Blanche Ames is one of those women of privilege. Of course, she graduated from Smith College in 1899. She was very privileged to have an elite education. She came, as you all know from the documentary, from a wealthy family, and she could have easily joined many other people of her background in living a life of leisure and privilege. She was motivated, as were many other women, many of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement, to take a broader look at society, at some of the issues in society, because she didn't devote herself only to expanding the expanding access to the vote, but also her interest in birth control, which was, of course, an even more unpopular movement. So Blanche Ames is one of these people who was committed to using her access to privilege to expand rights more broadly. She really believed in the possibility of improving society. And I should just mention, for those of you watching or on now who are students of American history, you'll know that these activities of Blanche Ames corresponded to an era of history that historians have named the Progressive Era, an era when there was a belief in the ability of people to achieve positive change. So Blanche Ames was one of those women who used her position of privilege to devote herself to improving American society. And two ways that she saw that would improve society, she believed, were expanding access to the ballot and granting women more control over their own ability to reproduce.
I wanted to ask you about Ames' cartoons and how she used cartoons to lobby for suffrage.
So Blanche Ames was a wonderful artist, as we all know. I mean, one of the things that she did that, and as the New York Times obituary cited her for, was her brilliant illustrations of orchids that accompanied her husband's books. So Blanche Ames was a very gifted, committed artist. And in the 19-teens, she decided to draw cartoons about the women's suffrage movement. The Women's Journal newspaper that was mentioned in this documentary was the nation's leading women's suffrage newspaper. It was published here in Boston. And as 1915 approached and 4 states were considering whether to, in their state constitutions, expand the right to vote for women, Blanche decided to draw cartoons to support that. And her cartoons are brilliant. Some were shown in the documentary. If you Google them, you can find them, or I could send them to you subsequently. But her cartoons are very non-threatening. That was a very important thing. As the documentary mentioned, anti-suffragists had often portrayed suffragists as being masculinized, spinsters, unattractive, people who wanted to essentially make fundamental, radical social change. And Blanche Ames's suffragists were wives, mothers, pillars of society who would only improve society by having access to the vote and being able to participate in decision-making. It's also true that Blanche's own class background is reflected in her cartoons. Her cartoons depict white, middle class or affluent women who are well fed, the children are well clothed, and so forth. She does, in the one cartoon that was mentioned about President Taft, depict an anti-suffragist essentially mocking people who would deny rights to other women because they themselves have all the rights they need. But in general, Blanche's Ames cartoons do reflect her own background and the people that she knew in her life. You're still on mute again.
I know.
I'm
Do you know who the African-American woman who spoke a couple times in the film? I didn't catch her name.
No, and I actually was not. She looks familiar. I suspect I do, but honestly, at the moment, I am drawing a blank on her name.
No problem.
I'm sure she was listed in the credits at the end.
I'll have to check the credits. Thank you. Another question is about the writer and narrator, who I guess her name is Kate Kleiss, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I don't know anything more about her, but if people are interested, that's something we can look up to learn more about her.
She is a writer. She has written some books, a narrator, and I think she has done a superb job in this film.
You already spoken about the cartoons, but one question is what historic, political, and artistic images did Ames deploy to persuade her audience that the vote was women's natural right?
Well, what she did is she tried to make it, I think, very non-threatening and to draw from images of American history. For example, the Cradle of Liberty image that was shown. She didn't have that many cartoons. So the sum total of her suffrage cartoons is fewer than a dozen well-known cartoons, but they were very, very powerful. So for instance, one of them shows a man making a cradle with Faneuil Hall as the background or the headboard of the cradle. And she says that there's room enough for girls and boys, two babies in the cradle. So she draws on images from American history to persuade people that this is just a natural continuity of the rights of all to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Another one of my favorite cartoons is one where she depicts an anti-suffragist. Anti-suffragists often claimed, as I mentioned earlier, that they were protected by privilege, that they were on this pedestal protected by men. And she portrays an anti-suffragist on essentially a sham pedestal. It's flimsy. And she has with her a bird and a dog named Dodo and Fido. And it's the suffragist who is on the solid, substantial pillar with children, love, motherhood, religion, all the fundamental core values that anti-suffragists tried to claim as their own. Blanche was saying, no, they're wrong. It's actually the woman, the Republican mothers, the ones who raise the children, who are the heart and soul of the nation. And it's that solid pillar of woman, and they deserve the vote. You know, it's essentially a continuation of the same kind of argument that Abigail Adams had made 200 years earlier, or almost 200 years earlier, that the nation's core depends on educated, interested, committed mothers. When Abigail Adams wrote to John in 1776, remember the ladies, you know, Blanche Ames is essentially, to some extent, picking up on those same themes all those years later.
I'm continuing with the images. Do you see a connection between the negative images used to portray the suffragists and the negative images used to play the women who proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment later in our next century?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, there's some work that's been done by scholars showing just that. The notion of woman as, you know, as angry, as out of control, you know, that rage has taken over them. And in particular, the notion that women who support change are threatening, that they would turn the world topsy-turvy. So some of the images that Blanche Ames was responding to, for instance, were very powerful cartoons that would show a woman going off to vote while her husband was at home holding the baby or preparing dinner. You know, all these things that, you know, of course, only men could vote to expand suffrage. So it was very important for the anti-suffragists to persuade men that their life would be changed for the worse. And so Blanche was responding to the fear of men that radical women would turn their lives upside down. And I think that is very much true in the Equal Rights Amendment debate. The way in which the opponents were able to prevail ultimately, or at least so far, was by persuading men and conservatives in society that radical women were out to foment change, to turn life as they knew it upside down in a threatening, dangerous manner.
We have a question about someone named Oakes Plimpton, who was associated with the Tufts University Mountain Club in the 1970s, who was a student or a recent grad, presumably. And the questioner is asking, was this person from the family in the film?
You know, my expertise is obviously in Blanche Ames in terms of the women's suffrage movement and the birth control movement and those two movements. I was told that Bill Ames, who's the executive producer of the phone, is in the Zoom group. And if there were other questions about other Ames relatives, that he might be an appropriate person to turn to. So if he is available, he might be the best person to answer that question.
Is Bill Ames available here?
He won't be able to
Because
talk.
he's not a panelist,
He's
right?
yeah, but he could type in the Q&A if he's here.
Okay.
I mean, I would assume with a name like that, there was probably a family connection, but it's just, and there are many, many Ames relatives. It's just not something that I can particularly personally comment on.
Thanks. There actually aren't any other questions that have been submitted. There's a lot of good information that that's been put in the chat that would be helpful to people. And if you have any other questions, now's the time to type them in before we finish our program today. And I'm just getting a heartfelt thank you from one of our attendees. And oh, actually, I have a question about Blanche Ames as an inventor. That's the extent of the question.
Oh, all right. Well, so Blanche Ames was also an inventor. She's particularly famous for her color wheel invention, but she was a brilliant, diverse woman who, used her brain in many, very talented, very creative. And of course, it's important to also keep in mind, and the film does an excellent job of pointing this out, that she had the privilege to be able to do things like go up to her studio and work in these different capacities, because of course she did also have help with the home and help with the children. But she was a remarkable, hands-on woman with a very broad outlook in life and endlessly interested. The fact that, as the film mentions, she was basically 80 when the biography she wrote of her grandfather was published. I mean, she was tireless throughout her life, highly energetic.
And that was 600 pages, as I recall. That's
Yes.
amazing. And certainly, speaking of, again, you spoke about privilege with her birth control efforts. I think you could speak to the fact that she really understood how motherhood was much more difficult for poor women who didn't have the kind of help that she had. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, when Blanche Ames was the president of the Massachusetts Birth Control League, one of the things that are in the papers of the Massachusetts Birth Control League are some of the extraordinary, really tragic, pathetic letters written by some desperate woman seeking help, seeking access to safe contraceptives because they had no choice, sadly, but to give birth year after year after year. So Blanche was very well aware of that. So she and her commitment to the birth control movement stemmed both from her sympathy to the plight of women. She also was a strong advocate of free speech, which was also something going on in the 19-teens and the 1920s. These are the years when the American Civil Liberties Union, for example, is birthed. But Blanche Ames's courage in supporting that movement really was very extraordinary, because while suffrage was still opposed by many, there were thousands of people working on behalf of the women's suffrage movement in that era, but there were very many fewer working in support of the birth control movement. But I think Blanche Ames always understood, way ahead of many other people of her times, even some of the suffrage advocates, that the right to vote was critical, but without the right to control one's reproductive functions, even the right to vote wasn't really going to fundamentally change the way many women led their lives, or their lives were foisted upon them.
Yes, and you've spoken about how those struggles are still relevant today. And I have a specific question about whether Blanche was the engineer of the pool that we saw in the film, since we know that she designed the building. Was she the engineer of the pool? Do you know?
That again, there were people who are far more expert on the architecture of Borderlands than I am. My understanding, my belief is that yes, because I'm not aware of any part of the house that she did not have her thumbprint on. But again, the details, and I always hate when I am asked questions that I can't authoritatively answer. But there are people, as I said, who really are experts on the Borderlands site more than I am. But Blanche's Ames fingerprints are all over every aspect of the construction, to the best of my knowledge.
We have a comment from William Ames saying she designed it. So
okay, perfect.
I guess there's our answer.
Right.
I want to thank you so much, Barbara, for your time. I learned so much from the film itself, and then to have you here today in person to answer our questions is just fantastic. So especially on this hot day, I'm going to thank everybody for coming, and I look forward to going to Borderlands myself, and I welcome you all. There is another question at the last minute. Is there a relation between either Blanche and Oaks to the architectural gem Ames building in downtown Boston? I'm trying to think which building that is.
Gretchen probably is an expert on that through her work. So I think we should turn that over to Blanche, but I think that has to do with the Ames Shovel Company, but I'm going to let Gretchen.
Right. It would be Oaks Ames family. The Ames Shovel Company is the one that built the Ames building, which was a office building for them and then became a boutique hotel and is now owned by one of the universities, I think Suffolk, but one of the tallest stone masonry buildings built without a steel infrastructure. But yes, so it's the family, but not Blanche's. It's very odd that Blanche is an Ames and Oaks is an Ames, but it's the Oaks Ames Shovel Company that built that building.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you we have people being available to answer questions as they come up. And I think that is the last, let me just see. Yeah, that is the last question that I see. So thank you, everyone. Again, particularly thank you, Barbara, and all the sponsors of the program who worked really hard to bring this program to you today. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me. And Borderlands is a wonderful, wonderful site, and the grounds are beautiful. And for those of you who haven't been, I highly recommend a visit there.
I look forward. Thank you.